Thanks everyone for showing up. This is a copy of the Seattle chapter presentation that I just did on the top threats to cloud computing. So for those of you who are familiar, maybe you're not, I'm just going to be going over the previous top threats release that we had done, what it entails, a lot of the details within it. And then I am going to provide the updated statistics of our new findings that will be released in March, I think it is. I think we're set to release the new top threats to cloud computing. I think it's called the Pandemic 11, the new one coming out. We appropriate titled, and I did not come up with that. That was a group, the group decided on that. So if anyone doesn't like it, let me know, because I think it's interesting for the most part. So quickly for the agenda, I'm just going to go over the purpose of the top threats report, how we identify the threats, how to utilize them. I know the document, we're addressing threats, but it's really, well, what's the point of having this document if we don't actually know how to mitigate anything? We're going to get into the deep dive document, so the top threats egregious 11 deep dive, take a look at the details within that. Then next, we're going to jump into the threat modeling that the group has been working on for, I'd probably say, the last year. With the cloud threat modeling document release, we're trying to build that into the actual pipeline for what we find for top threats year to year. And then just discuss a bit of moving into the future for the actual working group itself and some further releases. So before we begin, I just wanted to give some statistics that are currently out there. And I think these are from 2020 to 2021, a few cybersecurity details. So the first one is 95% of cybersecurity breaches are caused by human error. So human error can be anything from missing a control, not properly implementing a control, can be clicking on a phishing email. It can be any of those. So when we say, or when a company tries to input controls into their enterprise space for security, so going down a checklist, like using the CIS critical controls, password protecting things, if you're not doing that properly, that actually is a human error. And so what that comes down to are things like someone not being properly trained, not staying up to date on the current trends and patterns. So those are all things that are human error. Next, we have 68% of business leaders feel their cybersecurity risks are increasing. Us being CSA, we obviously know that those risks are increasing daily, but it's at least hopeful to see that the business leaders are finding that in their own space. It kind of gives us a picture that maybe they're tracking this now a little bit better. Doesn't necessarily mean they're fixing it or correcting it, but at least they're noticing it. On average, only 5% of companies' folders are properly protected. Now, that's a Verona statistic, and that's actually very scary. 5%. So that means 95% of the remaining folders of any users or cloud environments have no controls to protect them. Next, we have data breaches exposed 36 billion records in just the first half of 2020. 36 billion. This could be credit card information, emails, anything found on the black market or dark web, health information items and things like that. So when we talk about records, it could be anything that has to do with personally identifiable information or business information. Okay, so what's the purpose of this entire top threats report? Well, we want to identify the last few years of major breaches, and this really was to raise awareness for threats, risks, and vulnerabilities that are in the cloud enterprise space. It really comes down to providing a logical way to interpret threat analysis and then incorporate any mitigation techniques. So the top threats report, we do provide some mitigation techniques via, cloud controls matrix. It's not a one-stop shop. It's not going to protect everything, but it at least helps create that baseline to at least get your feet a bit wet and move forward in the process. And there's really no limitation to its use. People see it, and I said it on the last presentation, and I really like to hit on this point for any framework, really. There's no limit to any way that you use any framework. Some are pretty straightforward, like input 10 to 12 password characters and set that for all employees. Now that has a limit. Things like this, that's more of a standard or more of an open source framework. There's no limit to how you use it. You can use it to look at the top breaches and that's it, or you can use it to incorporate into your own security policies. And it's really about being flexible with documents like this and how you're moving forward into the future with its use. So how are all of these threats identified? Well, in the volunteer group, we get together and we think of 20 to 30 of the top breaches over time. So this isn't a limit to what we've seen recently. It's just putting together our top idea or our thoughts on what we think have caused breaches. So things like identity access management, breaches to data, cloud security spills, EC2 instances, and things like that, human error, HR not implementing best practices. And we compile all of these onto a list. And then that list gets put into the survey report, which our last one went out a few months ago, and we just are now building out on that. And it's to identify main security flaws and appropriately categorize them. And so how we do this is we allow the enterprise space or anyone who receives the link to the survey really to appropriately rank what they have seen in their own research, what they've seen at work, what they hear on the news, and they rank it in order of importance. So 1 through however many we decide to choose. The last one was 11. This one also is going to be 11. And it's just kind of a number. If we see a statistic, say there were 12 and 11 or 12 had a 1 or 2 point gap, that's where we kind of cut it off. And so that's kind of the focus of how we build this out, is that cutoff point is if it's larger than X variable, really, if that makes sense. And so what this top threat survey report does is it gives an enterprise a say in what they've seen, and it really brings the community together on the same ideologies and forecasts and brings that all together to culminate into a bigger picture, right? It's one thing to have an idea of what you think's going on. It's another to see results from all of these other enterprises, which I will say this report only had, the one that was released last, I think 200 responses. The one we just got out of finalization had over 700. So there has been a massive growth on response and eyes on this actual top threats report. And it's really nice to see. And from a logistics standpoint, I think that's positive for CSA too. We're obviously getting more eyes on currently with reports like this and giving the enterprise space an opinion on what's happening in the threat landscape. And this is how we ordered the last one. As you can see, we did 1 through 11. Data breaches was the last one that usually consistently stays number 1. The only other noticeable ones that we had were number 7, insecure interfaces and APIs. That originally was number 3 from prior research. And then number 11 was number 10 prior. So there's not a whole lot of shift, but we will take a look at what this year's comparison was to see if there were any new ones, if anything's changed, stayed the same. And I'll just give us a look at that. So utilizing the findings. So within the actual top threats report, after post-survey and compiling all this information, we just do a brief overview of the security incidents. So the first one, data breaches. Well, we'll give a general overview. We'll provide the business impact, but then we dig deeper to tell you what security guidance domains are actually relevant to this specific one. For me, when we include the security guidance, it's not meant as a control because the guidance isn't necessarily a control framework. But what it does provide is a general overview, it kind of the business management plane on how to handle a lot of this. So when you're given things like governance and enterprise risk management or legal issues, you can at least go to those security guidance areas and then take that to your business and tell them, okay, this is who needs to focus on this key area. And this is how we can kind of begin to resolving the issue. Within this, we also provide the CCM controls that are applicable to just data breaches or that specific threat. And this is what's a little bit different than the deep dive report because that gets a bit more granular. But for sake of just top threats, we pick the CCM controls that can impact things like a data breach. So it gets very specific in that case, but nothing extremely granular. And of course, this is taking the CCM for the data breach. So if we go back a slide and we take a look at, let's say 03 under application interface security was found for a CCM control in this. What we would have, or I should say, what we would like users to interpret this as is go to the CCM and take a look at that control ID in the domain, and then take a look at the actual implementation guidelines for that specific breach And then take a look at what you're doing and compare it to your own business. So are you counting the percentage of vulnerabilities by weakness or severity? Do you have an average time to threat resolution that you're doing? So from the time you find a threat on your system, are you categorizing it and are you finding a resolution? And if you are, how long is it taking you? Is it a few hours? Is it a day? Because what that's going to do is actually allow you to get a feel for what you're missing for any technology, right? So if it's taking you a week or two to find a resolution for any controls, it probably means you don't have a means to identify them. And so if it's taking a while to identify them, you now need to start prioritizing what security or what technology you're implementing within your enterprise space. This also comes down to things like service level objectives. And I mean, do you need to find things right away? Some cases you don't. CSA, I mean, I'm thinking from a standpoint of maybe a smaller company. If you have no critical data that needs to be, I say, massively protected, then there probably isn't a strong SLO for that. If you're a financial institution, you probably have minutes to maximum of an hour to find something, depending on how high the risk is. So this is just a means to take a quick overview, get a holistic view of what you need. And then from here, you can dig deeper into the control frameworks that CCM offers. So any ISO standards or CIS controls, you can start building those out a bit more. All right, so the deep dive, the fun part for our volunteers to dig a little bit deeper, use their own expertise and start cross-comparing a lot of what they know to the threats that we find from the survey report and the top threats report. So the use for the deep dive, and maybe this is useful for everyone on the call to know for maybe marketing, sales, is this really speaks well to architects, engineers, analysts, security operations center analysts, and things like that. Even people in the risk department, they can take this, take a look at the breaches, and then we're giving such a granular look that they can actually compare their business to the type of breach. So Capital One, which we'll take a look at here shortly, financial institution, credit cards, whatever it may be. Well, if you're in another financial sector and you see that Capital One had an AWS breach, you might want to start taking a look at what they were breached on and cross-comparing it. So what the deep dive does is takes the top threats, and then from there, we took 9 examples of real-world attacks and breaches and cross-compared them to each of the egregious 11 breaches to see how many took place at each breach itself, if that makes sense. And we'll take a look at that here shortly. And it's a means for use and threat comparative analysis, understanding your threat vectors, and finding mitigation techniques. And I said this last night on the presentation, it's one thing to understand the actual threats, but it's another to actually know how to mitigate them. And I think that's a big issue in cybersecurity currently, is people just don't understand how to mitigate some of this stuff. You could have a discovery application finding these, telling you, hey, we need to fix it, but how do I fix that? And I think that's something that's going to be growing in the future, is telling you exactly how to mitigate those techniques when it comes to vendors. So if there's any vendors that are actually doing this currently, I know of a few myself. I think Lightspin's doing a good job. They actually provide you the MITRE ATT&CK plus mitigation techniques on any vulnerable systems found or any breaches, which is extremely helpful when it comes to cloud security. Okay, so this is within the deep dive. It's the threat analysis and the coverage by case study. So as I was saying, we have the 9 case studies across the top. And then on the left-hand side, we have the 11 top threat numbers. And this just goes through coverage of what each breach had as far as a threat went. So as we can see, the Capital One, I believe, was this 9? 7, one of those. And so it had whatever is here had a numbering for it. And so what we can do is we can move forward. For each of those, these are the controls from the CCM that were from each of the identified for the Capital One case. So there were a total of 16 controls from the Capital One case that could have helped mitigate or prevent that actual breach itself had they instituted some of these controls originally, right? So it's just a good look, and this is probably one of my favorite tables to look at, because it tells you just the sheer amount of controls that need to go into place to avoid a lot of this. And this comes into where people don't, necessarily have time or employees to take a look at this kind of stuff or implement. Because 16 controls might not seem like a lot, but to 4 to 10 person shop that have other competing priorities, it's quite a bit. And so I think it helps with that overall granular view of it. So this is what the diagram of the Capital One deep dive looks like. So what we do is we describe the threat actor. In this instance, we provided internal, and this is our generalization of what the issue probably was that could have initially prevented it. So inexperienced solutions architect or cloud architects or security engineers that really didn't have any specialization in understanding what should be secured. I believe in this instance, it was in EC2 bucket that was able to get like a forgery request on the side from Capital One to AWS. Now, this was an insider threat, so it was a former employee who had knowledge of the prior AWS operations. So the employee actually understood the flaws that were within the system of AWS and was able to bypass much of those. And so what we do is we provide the threat, which is going back, mapping back to the egregious 11 number 1 data breach. So what the attacker did was exfiltrate sensitive information of 106 million customer accounts. It also was the egregious 11 number 11, so abuse and nefarious use of cloud services. And then we go into the vulnerabilities, the technical impacts, business impacts. And then more importantly, this is where it gets a little bit better, is we take the controls from the prior slide and we're actually providing them for preventive, detective, and corrective measures for individuals. So again, if we're an enterprise space in the financial sector and we're using AWS, more than likely, we want to take a look at the vulnerabilities here. So misconfiguration and inadequate change control. And we want to go and map those back to preventive controls because those are going to be your initial ones. And then you want to focus on how to detect. And then you obviously want to scan your system and take a look at any findings and correcting those. And so those are all provided. And it's just a very good holistic view. High level, I would say there's a lot more controls than just the CCM that users will need, but it's a good start to build those baselines. All right, and so as I was telling everyone, this is the new versus old. On the left-hand side, it was pulled from our rough draft this morning. I wanted to get as close to accurate as I could for today's presentation, and I wanted to show you any that have changed. So as we can see, from the original, data breach was number 1. This year's is insufficient identity, credential access, and key management, so privileged account access. So that is actually our new number 1. And I actually think data breach in general was removed, and I think it was just a nomenclature. So it was spread out into a few different naming conventions. A few of these could be a part of data breaches, but as we can see, that is shifted. Misconfiguration is moved to number 3. Everything is basically moved down. So lack of cloud security is moved to 4. And then a few of these have been removed, like insufficient. No, that one is still there. I think it was account. Hijacking is actually not included on this year's. And so it's nice to see these results because it kind of we understand that people are seeing new things. If it was the same, I would actually be more concerned if everyone was answering the same as year to year. Because that's not realistic for security. And so the new ones that we did have removed also was limited cloud visibility. I don't think I see that one. Instead, now we have cloud storage data exfiltration, which this would have worked for instance, on the Capital One, because that was cloud storage data that was exfilled. And so we got a bit more granular with that. And if you remembered me saying those numbers, the survey average scores, you see how close 10 and 11 were? We were very close on cutting it off at 10, but that number, the median average was so close that we just decided to leave 11, and I think 12 was a whole point lower. So that's where that cutoff is. I promise you it's not random. There is some thought to that, but that's kind of how we pick the survey results and their respective ranks. I do want to go over what the top threats group for the future is. Threat-based modeling, I'm going to briefly just say, we had the cloud threat modeling release. I think it was last month or the month before, could have been longer, depending on COVID hours. But we want to start utilizing these threat-based modelings, doing these tabletops. We're doing a few in the next coming months. Minnesota, we're doing a tabletop exercise with threat modeling. And we really want to start showcasing in a physical form and in front of people how to do this. It's one thing for us to just write a document and provide it, but it's another to gamify it now and to allow people to see it in real time. Because I'm going to be completely transparent. As security experts, a lot of people don't understand how to threat model. A lot of security personnel push it onto someone else or hire vendors to do it. But threat modeling is the #1 priority when you're building out any security program, really. And so it's important for us to not only showcase the top threats document, but to showcase and allow people to see how you do threat modeling. It's not going to make them perfect, but it is going to help them along the way. We want to research new breaches and tactics. So Log4j, SolarWinds. We want in the coming year to showcase all of these threats and compare them. So in the new document that's releasing, we're going to find these breaches and we're going to continue to build on those and allow people to see what the main analysis of that was from the community. How did it happen? Going back to the mitigations, what CCM controls match up. We want to stay on top of that in the top threats group. And part of that is actually creating an updated and consistent template that is timely to market. What I mean by that is we have had the idea throwing around that we want to create a template for any user to go to our website if they've found a breach or heard of a breach or something has happened that's global news, but to share that with us and do their own analysis of it. Or even me, myself, as a researcher, to go ahead and do that analysis if I can, and at least provide that to someone on a continuation basis, right? So somewhat like the top threats, but just creating a live version of it and a proactive version of it. And that's an idea that's being tossed around. I think it would be very beneficial, more so than waiting biannually. We can still do that report, but there's also the idea if we do this, I think it's more beneficial, something like a MITRE attack or when CVEs get released or our own vulnerability database, right? Like we want those things to be immediate, actionable, but we can't do that if we're doing it biannually. And so that's just one of the ideas we have. And then of course the tabletop events. Now I have the Seattle chapter interest. I included that last night during the presentation. I think there is a lot of interest for it. I think we're going to get busy if we start advertising tabletop events. And that's just something for CSA that I think, we have the expertise here. We have a lot of people who are able and capable to do things like this. And I think for due diligence, it's kind of our job to help the community as a whole do these. And so I think these tabletop events will be important. And it doesn't even have to be threat modeling. It can be inclusive of building out policy and risk from an enterprise architecture standpoint, because that maps to the CCM. So if we're looking at a tabletop event, what can we include from our other research to really start fulfilling a lot of that? And so those are just general ideas on preparing for the future for the group itself. We want to do a lot more. I know the group also wants to do just more than the biannual releases. And we have people doing, cloud penetration testing playbooks, the cloud threat modeling, but I think we want to get a bit more deeper in the dirt with a lot of this stuff. And so we'll continue thinking about what we can do and go from there.